I never thought I'd say this, but sometimes silence hurts more than any scream ever could. That morning, the house was too quiet, not peaceful quiet, not the kind you enjoy on a Sunday with coffee and sunlight through the window. No, it was the heavy kind. The kind that presses down on your chest until breathing feels like a chore. The kind that fills every corner of your mind with echoes you don't want to hear. The kind that makes last night play on repeat. I hate you, Dad. 4 words. Just 4 words, but they hit harder than any fist could. They didn't just come from her mouth. They came from her heart. From the part of her that once clung to my leg when thunderstorms scared her. From the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders and tell me I was her hero. Now I was the villain in her story. I sat there at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the wood I'd sanded myself years ago. The same table where she did her homework. The same table where Laura, her mother, used to sit with a cup of tea humming quietly while watching the rain. That morning, the only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Every second sounded like a hammer against my chest. Tick, tick, tick. A reminder that time doesn't stop just because your heart wants to. My coffee had gone cold, untouched, just sitting there beside a sealed envelope, cream-colored, with my name written neatly on it in the lawyer's handwriting. I'd signed it last week just in case. Never thought I'd actually need it this soon, but life doesn't ask for permission before turning your world upside down. That envelope held my will, and I couldn't stop staring at it. I thought about tearing it open, rewriting it, or maybe burning it altogether. What was the point anymore? Everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed was supposed to be for her. My daughter. My Emily. The girl I once promised I'd protect from every pain this world could throw. Funny thing, though. Sometimes the pain doesn't come from the outside. Sometimes it walks right into your life wearing the same last name as you. I rubbed my temples trying to chase away the pounding in my head, but the words wouldn't leave. I hate you, Dad. They echoed through every empty hallway of that house. I could still see her standing there in the living room, eyes filled with anger and disappointment, voice shaking, tears she refused to let fall. She looked just like her mother when she was mad. Same fire, same stubbornness. But this time the anger wasn't for some small mistake or forgotten birthday. This was different. This was years of something deeper, something poisoned, and that's what broke me, because I knew where that poison came from. I wasn't a perfect man. God knows I made my share of mistakes. I yelled when I shouldn't have. I worked too much. I missed things that mattered. But betrayal, dishonor, those weren't my sins. Those were someone else's, someone I once called my brother. I leaned back in the chair and looked around. Every wall, every picture frame, every small dent in the wood told a story of the life I'd built from scratch. The calloused hands, the sleepless nights, the early mornings driving a rusted pickup through rain and heat, all so she could have more than I ever did. And now, she believed I'd thrown it all away. She believed him. It's a strange kind of heartbreak when the person you love most looks at you like a stranger, or worse, a disappointment. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't bother to check it. Probably another message from the lawyer reminding me about the reading later that morning. The will was supposed to be simple. Divide what little I had, leave clear instructions, make sure Emily was taken care of. That's all. But after last night I realized something. Maybe it was time she finally knew the truth. Not the version she'd been fed over the years. Not the twisted story someone else told her to make me look like the monster. But the truth, plain and raw. Because beneath every broken family, there's a moment, a choice, a lie, and in our case, the lie came from the man who once stood beside me as my best friend, my business partner, my so-called brother. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogging the cold coffee mug as if it could whisper back some kind of answer. It didn't. Nothing did. Outside, the sun was rising, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like an ending, like that kind of day where everything you thought you knew starts to crumble, and all that's left is truth waiting to be spoken aloud. I picked up the envelope and turned it in my hands, feeling the paper scrape against my calloused fingers. I thought about Emily's face, her trembling lips, the way her voice cracked when she shouted those words. She hated me, at least. She thought she did, but what she didn't know was that her anger wasn't really hers. It was borrowed planted in her heart years ago by someone who smiled to my face while stabbing me in the back. That's the cruelest thing about betrayal. It doesn't just break the betrayed. It poisons the ones watching from the sidelines. I took one last sip of the cold coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. Maybe that was fitting. The taste of something that used to be warm and comforting, now cold, harsh and hard to swallow. Then I said it aloud, just to hear the truth of it. Maybe it's time they all heard my side. My voice cracked a little. It had been a long time since I'd spoken to anyone without a wall between us. But this wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. This was about showing my daughter who her father really was. Because before I left this world, I wanted her to know one thing, that love can be twisted, trust can be stolen, but truth always finds its way home. And that morning, the morning after her words shattered me, I decided I'd stop running from mine. Let me take you back 25 years ago to a small town just outside Dallas, Texas. Back then, life was simpler, though I didn't realize it at the time. The roads were quieter. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and sawdust, and people still waved at each other from their porches. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Enough to smile. Enough to hope, enough to dream. Back then, I wasn't Thomas Reed the contractor. I was just Tom, a man with calloused hands, a stubborn heart, and a dream that hard work could fix anything broken. I started my first construction business with nothing but a borrowed pickup, a rusted set of tools, and faith, not in luck but in sweat. My father used to say, "Son, if your word is good and your hands don't quit, you'll never go hungry." I lived by that. Every nail I hammered, every wall I raised, it all meant something to me. It wasn't just work. It was proof that I could build a life worth living, and for a while, it really was. Because back then, I had Laura. Laura wasn't just my wife. She was the kind of woman who could make an empty room feel like home. She had that calm kind of warmth that didn't demand attention but filled the space just by existing. Her laughter had this way of softening even the hardest days. She could take a pot of leftovers and somehow make it taste like a feast. We met at a hardware store of all places. She was buying paint, trying to decide between sky blue and summer morning. I told her there wasn't a difference. She smiled, that kind of smile that feels like sunlight after rain, and said, "You'd be surprised, mister. Sometimes a shade makes all the difference." I married her 2 years later, right after my first job that didn't end in debt. And when Emily was born, our only child, my whole world shifted. I can still see her in that old backyard. A skinny little thing, always barefoot, always chasing something. Butterflies, her own laughter, or sometimes the dog who never stood a chance. Her knees were constantly scraped, her hair always tied up in 2 uneven ponytails. She used to run up to me when I came home from work, dirt on her cheeks, shouting, "Daddy, look! I built a house just like you." And sure enough, there she'd be, standing next to a crooked little tower of blocks, proud as could be. I'd laugh and tell her, "Guess you got my builder's hands, huh?" And she'd giggle, eyes bright and pure. "No, Daddy, I got your heart." And she was right. She had all of it. Every beat. Every ounce. Those were the good years. The golden ones. The kind you don't realize are perfect until they're gone. Our little house smelled like sawdust and cinnamon. Laura would hum to herself in the kitchen. Emily would draw on the floor with her crayons, and I'd sit on the porch at night with a beer, watching the sunset turn the sky orange and pink. I used to think, this is it. This is happiness. But happiness has a way of slipping through your fingers when you start chasing more than you need. I wanted to give them everything. A bigger house. A better life. A future where Laura never had to worry and Emily never had to struggle. That's what drove me. That's what made me push harder every day. And at first it worked. Business was good. Word spread fast in small towns, and before long, Tom Reed Construction was on trucks all over Dallas County. I had crews, contracts, even office space. People started calling me Mr. Reed. I wasn't used to that. I still remember the day I came home with my first big paycheck. Laura had just finished setting the table. I dropped the envelope in front of her and said, "We're finally gonna be okay." She smiled, but not in the way I expected. She took my hands and said, "Tom, we've always been okay. Money doesn't build families. Love does." I should have listened to her, but pride's a tricky thing. It makes you deaf to wisdom and blind to warning signs. Then came 2008. You remember that year? The world changed overnight. One week we were thriving. The next clients were canceling left and right. Phone stopped ringing. Checks stopped clearing. I'd built my business on faith and sweat. But faith doesn't pay invoices. And sweat doesn't stop debt collectors from calling. It felt like watching everything I built crumble brick by brick. I tried to stay calm. Told Laura it was just a bad month. But months turned into a year and the hole only got deeper. I started taking double shifts, small repair jobs, anything that paid. Nights I used to spend reading to Emily turned into late hours at job sites under cheap floodlights. I sold my old Chevy, the one I rebuilt by hand. That truck was a piece of my soul. But the mortgage came first. Laura told me we'd figure it out together, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She tried to keep our home warm, but every bill that came through the door froze a little piece of that warmth away. And me, I changed. The stress ate at me, slowly, quietly. It didn't show up all at once, and it crept in. I stopped laughing. I started snapping at small things. Emily would ask me to play, and I'd tell her I was tired. Laura would suggest we take a walk, and I'd say, I don't have time for that. Truth was, I didn't have time for myself anymore. Or them. When a man's pride starts to crack, he doesn't see it, but everyone around him does. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the company, the debts, the disappointment I'd become. And in that silence, guilt has a way of talking louder than anything else. One night Laura came to me. She sat beside me on the bed, her voice soft but steady. Tom, we'll be fine. You're working too hard. Emily misses you. I miss you. But instead of listening, I pushed her away, told her she didn't understand, that she didn't know what it was like to have everything resting on your shoulders. She just looked at me, heartbroken, and said, I don't want everything, Tom. I just want you. God. If I could go back, I'd hold her right then and never let her finish that sentence. But back then, I thought I was doing the right thing. Thought that pushing harder, working longer, sacrificing time would make it all worth it in the end. I didn't realize I was sacrificing them, and while I was too busy trying to save everything outside our walls, someone else was quietly stepping inside them. He came with smiles, with kind words, with offers to help. At first, I thought he was just being a friend. After all, he was my partner, my confidant, the man I'd trusted more than anyone outside my family. But looking back now, I can see the signs, how his visits grew more frequent, how Laura's voice softened when she mentioned him, how he always seemed to show up when I wasn't around. I didn't see it then, but I do now, because that's when he stepped in. The man who would one day take everything from me, not just my business, but my family's trust, my daughter's love, and my name, and all he had to do was smile. His name was Mark Delaney, my old business partner, and once upon a time, the man I trusted more than anyone outside my own family. We started Reed and Delaney Construction with a handshake and a dream. Two young guys with calloused hands, big hopes, and no clue just how cruel ambition could get when money got involved. Mark was always the talker, the kind of man who could sell water to a drowning man and make him thank him for it. He had that effortless charm, a smile that disarmed you, eyes that seemed honest until you learned how to read what was behind them. He wore polished boots, pressed shirts, and always smelled like expensive cologne, even on dusty job sites. Me? I was the guy in worn jeans and a sweat-stained cap, the one hammering nails while he signed contracts. It worked for a while, the perfect balance. He brought in the business and I built the dreams. We shook hands over beers after long days and swore we'd grow old running that company together. But then came 2008. The market tanked. The phones went silent and the smiles faded. I remember sitting across from Mark one late evening in the office. Lights dim, the sound of rain against the window. He was sipping whiskey, tapping his pen against a stack of unpaid invoices. I told him, "We'll get through this, partner. Just a rough season." He didn't say anything for a long while, then looked up with that fake grin of his and said, "Yeah, Tom, sure we will." That should have been my warning. A few weeks later, I showed up one Monday morning and my key wouldn't fit the lock. At first, I thought I'd grabbed the wrong one. Maybe my hand was shaking from too much coffee. But when I tried again, the door stayed closed. Through the glass, I saw new signs on the desk, new paperwork on the walls, and a stranger sitting where my receptionist used to be. When I asked what was going on, She looked at me nervously and said, "Mr. Delaney said you'd been let go." I remember standing there, drenched in confusion and disbelief, my reflection staring back at me from that glass door. Let go? From my own company? Later that day, I sat in a lawyer's office as he slid a thick folder across the table. Inside were signed papers, documents I'd never seen before, showing that I had voluntarily stepped down from ownership 2 months earlier. My name wasn't on anything anymore. Mark had filed everything quietly, forging my signature, doctoring the minutes of fake meetings. The lawyer said it was airtight. I had nothing left to fight with. I went to him, of course, straight to his big fancy house on the hill, the one my work had built. Every brick, every tile, every inch of it bore my sweat. He opened the door with that same smirk I used to think meant friendship. I said, "What the hell did you do, Mark?" He leaned on the frame, cool as ever, and said, "Tom, it's just business. You'll land on your feet." Those words still sting. I didn't land. I crashed, flat on the ground, scraping for work while he kept the name, the clients, the profits, and the story, and stories. Oh, they spread fast in small towns. Rumors started that I'd messed up the books, that I'd been drinking on the job, that I couldn't handle the pressure. Mark made sure everyone believed I was the weak link, the reason the company had to let me go. And people bought it. Even my friends stopped calling. Old clients stopped answering. But what cut deepest was seeing the doubt creep into my own home. Laura tried to be strong. God knows she did. But there were nights she'd stare at me with quiet questions in her eyes, ones she was too afraid to ask. And Emily, my little girl who used to run into my arms after work, now started pulling away. She was just a teenager then, impressionable, fragile. She heard the whispers at school, saw the way neighbors looked at us. I'd walk into her room, try to talk, but she'd barely look up from her phone. One night, she finally snapped and said, "Mom says you should have been smarter. Maybe Mr. Delaney just cared more." That was the first time I felt something inside me break. Mark didn't just take my business. He took my name, my pride, and slowly, he took my family. He'd come by the house sometimes, pretending to check on us, always dressed sharp, always bringing gifts, flowers for Laura, chocolates for Emily, and every time, that smile of his stretched just a little too wide. I used to think it was guilt. Now I know it was satisfaction, because the man who once shook my hand as a brother was now watching me fall apart piece by piece, and he enjoyed every second of it. He wasn't just stealing what I'd built. He was replacing me, or in every way that mattered. And the worst part? I let him in, I trusted him, and that trust would cost me everything. It was one of those nights that still live somewhere deep in my chest, the kind that returns uninvited when the rain taps against the windows. A Friday night, cold, heavy with thunder. The kind of night when the whole world feels like it's holding its breath before something awful happens. I remember walking in, drenched from work, boots muddy, the smell of sawdust still on my clothes. The house was dim. Only the kitchen light was on, and there she was, Laura, sitting at the table, shoulders hunched, a small lamp casting a circle of yellow light over a mess of bills, papers, and unopened envelopes. Her eyes were red. Not from exhaustion this time, but from crying. She looked up as I came in, and I knew, before she even said a word, that something was wrong. She had a piece of paper in her hand. My name was on it. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Tom, tell me the truth. Did you take the money?" For a second, I didn't even understand what she meant. "What money?" I asked. She looked at me like she was searching for something in my face, something she wanted to believe but couldn't find. "Mark came by today," she said quietly. "He told me you'd taken money from the company before you left, that the books didn't match." And right there, that was the moment everything began to collapse. I felt the blood rush to my head. My hand started shaking. I slammed my fist down on the table so hard the cups rattled, and Laura flinched. Not because she was afraid I'd hurt her, but because the man standing in front of her didn't look like the one she used to know. "I would never steal from my family, Laura. Never." The words came out hoarse, strangled, desperate. But desperation, I've learned, never sounds like truth. She sat there silently for a while, her eyes wet, her lips pressed tight as if she was holding back every word that could still destroy me. Finally, she whispered, "I want to believe you, Tom. I do, but everything points to you. The documents. The transfers. Even your name's on them. My name. The name I'd built from nothing. The one I'd carried with pride. Now written on the same papers that painted me a thief. And all of it, every last detail, had Mark's fingerprints all over it. I tried explaining. I tried shouting, begging her to see through the lies. To remember who I was, but she was already slipping away from me. You can't reason with someone whose trust has been cracked by betrayal, even if the betrayal wasn't yours. That night, I sat on the porch after she went to bed, staring at the rain, my hands trembling around a cold cup of coffee. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Something inside me was screaming, and not in anger, but in dread. The kind that whispers, "You're about to lose everything." And I was right. Because when I woke up the next morning, they were gone. The house was too quiet. Her closet was half empty. The drawers were left open like a storm had passed through. On the kitchen table lay a single folded note weighed down by her wedding ring. "I need space," it read. "Please don't come after us. It's better for Emily if we stay apart for a while." That sentence, "it's better for Emily," felt like a knife in my chest. I sat in that empty kitchen for hours. Maybe days, I honestly don't remember. The walls seemed smaller, the silence heavier. Every sound, the ticking clock, the dripping faucet, mocked me with the rhythm of a life that kept going while mine stopped. I tried calling. The line rang and rang, then disconnected. I wrote letters, and dozens of them, poured my heart out on every page, explaining, pleading, telling her to check the records, to talk to the lawyers, to look me in the eyes and see the truth, but none of it came back. No replies. No visits. It was like my wife and daughter had vanished into a world where I didn't exist. Months turned into years. Every birthday, I'd drive to their new house, stand across the street with a small gift for Emily, watching from afar as Mark's car sat in the driveway. He was always there, always helping, always fixing things, always around. He became the man who showed up to school, events when I wasn't invited, the man who helped Laura with bills until she got back on her feet, the man who brought flowers when she was sick, who drove them home from church, who smiled at neighbors like he'd always belonged. And slowly, he did belong in their world. Mine was just a memory they didn't want to remember anymore. I found out years later from one of Emily's old teachers that Mark even started introducing himself as a close family friend, sometimes even just as Emily's uncle. That burned more than any lie he ever told. Then came the day that broke what was left of me. Laura passed away, heart failure, sudden. She was only 47. I got the call from a mutual friend, not from my daughter, not from family. I drove all night to the funeral, heart pounding, hands trembling on the wheel. When I got there, the church was already full. I stood at the back, drenched in rain and disbelief, watching as Mark stood at the front, his hand on Emily's shoulder, my daughter's shoulder, as if he were the one who had the right to comfort her. I wanted to run up there. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Because the look Emily gave me when our eyes met, it wasn't anger, it was distance, like she was staring at a stranger. She turned away before I could even take a step forward. Mark wrapped an arm around her, guiding her back to the pew. He didn't even look at me. He didn't have to. His silence said it all. "You've lost." And in that moment, standing in the rain outside the church doors, I realized something that would haunt me for years. Hadn't just lost my business, I hadn't just lost my wife. I had lost my place in my own family story. Mark had rewritten it, and I was the villain in his version. And that night, as I sat alone in my truck after the funeral, watching the rain blur the world into streaks of gray, I made myself a quiet promise. Someday the truth would come out, and when it did, I wouldn't need to shout, because real justice doesn't need noise. It needs patience, and I had plenty of that left. 15 years. That's how long it took for silence to start sounding like peace, or at least something close to it. I'd rebuilt, brick by brick, from the ruins of the man I used to be. Not fast, not proud, not loud, and just steady. Quiet, started small, a one-man renovation company under a different name. No big signs, no advertising, just word of mouth, one satisfied client at a time. I didn't want attention anymore. I just wanted purpose. Every morning I'd wake before dawn, pour myself a black coffee and drive out to the sites before the world started moving. There was something healing about working with your hands again, cutting wood, sanding walls, fixing something broken and actually seeing it come back together. It was like therapy, except the kind where you sweat instead of talk. My life became simple. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. No friends, no noise. Just the hum of the saw, the smell of pine, and the ache in my back that reminded me I was still alive. I'd tell myself that Emily was happy somewhere, that she had her life, her peace, her family, that maybe someday she'd come back. But the years passed, and the phone stayed silent. Until that Sunday. It was one of those lazy afternoons where the air feels too still, the kind that makes you want to sit on the porch and just exist. The sun was starting to dip low behind the trees, casting long orange streaks across the old wood floor. That's when my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. But something, maybe instinct, maybe hope, made me swipe that green button. "Hello?" I said. There was a pause, just breathing on the other end. Then softly, like the echo of a dream I'd forgotten how to have, came a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years. "Dad?" I swear my heart stopped. For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat closed up. It was her, Emily. I finally managed. Her voice trembled just a little, like she was holding back 1,000 memories at once. "Yeah. It's me." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt before. I didn't know what to say. Should I apologize again? Should I pretend everything was okay? Should I tell her how much I missed her every single day? But she spoke first. "Can we talk?" 2 words. That's all it took to undo 15 years of quiet. I told her yes, of course. Anytime, any day. And she said she'd come by that afternoon. When I hung up, I just stood there in the middle of my living room, the phone still in my hand, staring at the floor like I'd seen a ghost because, in a way, I had. When her car finally pulled into the driveway, my hands were trembling. I wiped them on my jeans and waited by the door. The engine stopped. The door opened. And there she was, my little girl, except she wasn't little anymore. She stepped out in heels, her hair tied back neat, wearing a beige coat that looked expensive but tasteful, the kind her mother would have loved. Her face had changed, matured, grown sharper, but those eyes, those were still Laura's eyes, gentle, thoughtful, searching. She smiled when she saw me, polite but distant. The kind of smile you give to someone you're not sure you can trust yet. I opened the door wide. "Hey, sweetheart." She hesitated for a moment, just a flicker, then stepped forward and hugged me. It wasn't long, and it wasn't tight. But it was real. And for a man who'd forgotten what his daughter's embrace felt like, even a few seconds was enough to break him. When we sat down in the living room, I noticed her eyes wandering. She looked at the old photos on the mantel, pictures of her as a kid, her mother in the garden, me holding up a half-finished house with a proud grin. She smiled softly. "You still keep these?" "Every day," I said. "They remind me what mattered." She nodded, and for a while we just talked about small things, her work, her friends, the town. I told her about my little company, how I'd been staying busy. It was polite, almost awkward, but beneath the surface, there was something fragile, like 2 people walking across ice, afraid to step too hard. Then, after a long pause, she looked down at her hands and said quietly, "Dad, there's something I need to tell you." I could feel the shift in the air. That sentence, so the way she said it, had weight. "I'm getting married." I froze. For a moment I just stared at her, and then slowly I smiled. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Really, who's the lucky guy?" Her lips parted, and what came next hit me like a freight train. Mark's son. Tyler. The world stopped. I didn't hear the clock. I didn't feel the air. I just sat there, watching her lips move, but everything went quiet, like someone had turned the sound off on my life. I blinked, forcing myself to breathe. My mouth went dry. "Tyler." "Delaney?" I asked, even though I already knew. She nodded, smiling softly, unaware that her words were cutting through me. "Yeah. Tyler. He's not like his father, Dad. He's different. He's kind. He loves me." Her voice carried a hint of defense, like she'd been waiting for me to argue. Maybe Mark had warned her. Maybe he'd painted me as the bitter old man who couldn't let go. So I just swallowed hard, forced a smile, and said, "Of course. I'm happy for you." It came out steadier than I felt, but inside, my chest was burning, because I knew Mark. I knew how his mind worked, always calculating, always turning situations to his advantage. And if there was one thing he'd always wanted more than my business, more than my reputation, it was to own every piece of my life that I ever loved, and now, he was about to get my daughter too. Emily kept talking, about wedding plans, the venue, how Tyler made her laugh, how he reminded her of the man she wished I used to be. Each word twisted deeper, but I didn't let it show. I just nodded, smiled, asked polite questions, the kind a father's supposed to ask. Because if I'd learned anything over the years, it's that anger gives your enemies power, and I wasn't giving Mark that again. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me again, this time a little tighter. "Dad," she whispered. "I'm really glad we talked." I smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Me too, sweetheart, always." She walked out to her car, waving as she drove off. And when the sound of the engine faded into the distance, I sat back down, my hands shaking, staring at the empty cup on the table. The storm I'd buried for 15 years was rising again, because this time, it wasn't just business, it wasn't just betrayal. This time, it was family, and for the first time in years I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The night of the engagement party was colder than I expected for spring. The air had that sharp edge that made your breath visible under the lights. I remember standing outside the hall for a long while before walking in, gripping the steering wheel and watching the people through the windows. Everyone was dressed in their best. Fine suits, shimmering dresses, the smell of perfume and expensive champagne already spilling out each time the door opened. I didn't belong there, and I knew it. My hands were rough. My suit was 10 years old, and I drove up in a pickup that looked like it had seen more winters than half the guests combined. Still, I told myself a father should show up. No matter what had happened, no matter how far apart life had pulled us, a father shows up. So, I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and stepped inside. The warmth hit me first. Music, laughter, clinking glasses, the faint buzz of money in the air. It was being held at the Delaney estate, of course it was. The place had changed since I'd last been near it. Bigger, shinier, almost arrogant in the way it gleamed under the chandeliers. The walls were covered in those kinds of family portraits that try too hard to prove happiness. As soon as I walked in, heads turned. You could feel it, that slight pause in the room, the kind where people don't say anything but their eyes do. I could almost hear the whispers forming, the names being passed around like rumors at a high school reunion. "Is that him? Tom Reed? The one who—" "Yeah, that's the guy." I kept walking, slow and steady, pretending I didn't notice. The truth was, I noticed everything. Every smirk, every whisper, every pitying glance. 15 years later, and I was still the man Mark Delaney had painted me to be. The fallen partner. The thief, the failure. Then from across the room, I saw him, Mark Delaney. He hadn't changed much, and just older, grayer at the temples, but that same smug look still clinging to his face like it was part of his skin. His suit probably cost more than I made in a month. He was holding a glass of whiskey, laughing at something some investor said, until his eyes landed on me, and that laugh froze. For a split second, I saw something, surprise, maybe even discomfort, flash across his face. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by that grin I knew too well, the one that never reached his eyes, the one that always meant trouble. He handed his drink to someone, straightened his jacket, and started walking toward me. Each step deliberate, slow, confident. "Well," he said, loud enough for people nearby to hear, "if it isn't Tom Reed. Still around, huh?" His voice had that oily smoothness that always made my stomach turn. I forced a small smile and extended my hand. "Guess I am." Our hands met, his soft and manicured, mine rough and calloused. That handshake felt like shaking hands with a memory I'd rather have buried. He leaned in closer, his breath warm with whiskey. "Try not to embarrass yourself tonight, old friend. Some people never forget, you know." He patted my shoulder like he was doing me a favor, then took his drink back from the waiter. I could feel my jaw tightening, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I wanted to say something, to throw every truth I'd buried straight in his face. But I stopped myself. Not here. Not tonight. Then I heard a voice that pulled me back from the edge. Dad. Emily. She looked radiant, glowing with that happiness only young people in love seem to carry. She walked toward me, her arm looped around Tyler's, Mark's son. She looked perfect, and so did he. They both did. Like a photograph come to life, Emily, I said softly. You look beautiful. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Thanks, Dad. Then after a beat, her smile faded slightly. Please, don't start anything tonight, okay? It was the tone that cut me more than the words. Not the plea of a daughter worried about her father, but the warning of someone expecting him to mess things up. As if I'm the problem, I thought. I'm not here to start anything, I said quietly. Just to see you happy. Tyler extended a hand, polite and stiff. Good to see you, Mr. Reed. I shook it. Firm grip, nervous eyes. He didn't seem like his father, not yet anyway. But then again, I'd once thought the same about Mark. The three of us stood there in awkward silence until Emily excused herself to greet other guests. Tyler followed, leaving me standing alone in a room that suddenly felt smaller than it was. I walked toward the back of the hall, away from the crowd, pretending to look at the photos displayed on the wall. Pictures of Emily and Tyler at vacations, charity events, dinners, every image carefully chosen to show perfection. Then my eyes landed on one, a photo of Mark, his arm around Emily at what looked like a college graduation. Her smile was bright, genuine. His hand rested on her shoulder, the same place mine used to rest when she was little. My throat tightened. I stood there staring until I felt someone step beside me. Mark again. You missed a lot, he said, pretending to sip his drink. You'd be proud of her if you'd been there. I am proud of her, I said. He smirked. Sure you are. Though you've got to admit she did all right without you. That's when I looked at him. Really looked at him. The slick confidence, the easy charm, the way he still thought he owned every room he walked into. But behind all that, I caught something else, something small, hidden behind his eyes. Fear, because deep down he knew I hadn't forgotten. He knew I still carried the truth. I guess we'll see, I said quietly, setting my glass down. He frowned slightly, just enough for me to notice. Before he could reply, the sound of a spoon tapping a glass filled the room. Someone called for attention. The music softened. The crowd gathered around as Emily and Tyler stood at the front. Mark, of course, joined them. His arm went around his son, his other hand proudly resting on Emily's shoulder. He looked like a man who had everything, family, wealth control. And as the toast began, I realized something I hadn't before. My daughter, around my own flesh and blood, I didn't really know who her father was anymore. She only knew the story, he'd told her. The lies he'd spun so perfectly that they'd become her truth. And standing there in that glittering room full of laughter, champagne, and fake smiles, I made myself another promise. I wasn't leaving until I found a way to take back what he stole. Not the money, not the company, but my daughter's truth. The days after the engagement party passed like a fog that wouldn't lift. I went through the motions, waking up, making coffee, pretending to work. But my mind was elsewhere. Every sound of my phone made my chest tighten. I hoped foolishly it would be Emily. It wasn't. Until one quiet Friday evening, just a week before her wedding, I heard that knock on the door again. When I opened it, she stood there, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She wasn't the calm, polished young woman I'd seen at the engagement party. She looked different, restless, angry, defensive. Can I come in? She asked flatly. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. Of course, she didn't sit at first. She just stood near the window, looking around as if the place itself made her uncomfortable. Maybe it did. My house wasn't fancy. It was small, simple, filled with old furniture that smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee. Nothing like the polished marble world she'd grown used to. When she finally sat down, she didn't look at me. I've been hearing things, she started, her voice trembling just a bit. Tyler said his dad told him you've been saying terrible things about him. That you've been warning people not to trust them. That you think I'm making a mistake. I blinked. What? Don't lie, Dad, she snapped. Just don't. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Emily, I haven't said a word to anyone. I haven't seen or spoken to anyone from that family except you. Whatever you heard, it's not true. She finally looked up at me then, and her eyes were full of frustration. You always say that. But somehow it's never your fault, is it? You always play the victim. Her words stung. That's not fair, I said quietly. You don't know the full story. I know enough, she said sharply. I know you and Mark had your issues years ago, but I also know Mom never trusted you after that. She said you ruined everything, and now, 15 years later, you're still holding on to grudges. You can't just let me be happy, can you? Her voice rose with each sentence. I could see her mother's fire in her. That same quick temper, that same unwillingness to see beyond the surface. I wanted to shout. To tell her everything right then and there. How Mark stole the company, how he lied, how her mother turned on me because of him. But I saw the way she was looking at me, defensive, angry, already convinced I was the villain, and shouting wouldn't fix that. So I tried to reach her the only way I knew how. Softly. Emily, I said, I know what people have told you. I know how it must look from where you stand. But the truth, the real truth, it's not what you've been told. She shook her head, her voice trembling. Then why does everyone say the same thing? Why does every story end with you being the one who walked away? The one who failed? You could have fought harder. You could have been there for us. But you didn't. I swallowed hard, trying to find words that didn't sound like excuses. You were just a little girl when it all happened. You didn't see what I saw. You didn't hear the lies that were whispered in your mother's ear. I was fighting, Emily, you just couldn't see it. Her eyes glistened for a moment, but then she turned away. I don't want to hear it anymore. Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating. The kind that feels alive, like it's pressing on your chest. Then, she stood. And before I could say another word, she said it. The words that would echo in my head for the rest of my life. I hate you, Dad. It wasn't just anger. It was finality. The way she said it, sharp, certain, like she meant to cut ties with the sound itself. I froze. My lips parted, but nothing came out. There were no words big enough to hold that kind of pain. She stormed toward the door, grabbed her coat, and before I could move, the door slammed behind her. The sound of it hit me like a gunshot. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door she'd just closed, hoping, stupidly, that she might come back, that maybe she'd open it and say she didn't mean it. But she didn't. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally sat down. The house felt emptier than it ever had. Not just quiet, hollow. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands trembling so hard that half of it spilled onto the table. I hate you, Dad. The words replayed in my mind over and over, until they didn't even sound like words anymore. Just echoes. Hollow, endless, cruel. And that's when something inside me finally broke. Not in anger. Not in rage, just tiredness, the kind that seeps into your bones. I realized I'd spent 15 years waiting for the world to fix itself, waiting for truth to reveal itself, waiting for time to heal something that had never been given the chance to mend. But waiting had cost me everything. It was time to stop waiting. It was time she knew the truth. Not as a story from Mark's mouth. Not as a rumor from the past, but from me, directly. No shouting. No revenge plan. No drama. Just truth. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the old photograph of Emily as a child, missing her 2 front teeth, grinning proudly while holding the birdhouse we'd built together. That photo was the last time she'd ever looked at me with pure trust. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I called my lawyer, Mr. Jenkins. He'd been with me since before the fall, one of the few who'd never turned his back when things went bad. His voice on the other end was calm, curious. Tom, it's been a while. I need you to arrange something, I said. Something private, he paused. Private? Yes, I said quietly. I want to make some changes. To my will. He didn't ask questions. Just said, of course. Come by tomorrow morning. We'll take care of it. After I hung up, I sat there looking out the window at the pale morning sky. The first rays of light touched the fence I'd built with my own hands years ago. Worn, splintered but still standing just like me. That day, I began writing everything down. Every letter, every document, every proof I'd kept hidden all these years. Not to prove Mark wrong, not to make anyone pay, but so my daughter would know who her father truly was. Not through anyone else's story, but through his own truth. That was the day I stopped being silent. And that was the day the story began to turn. The morning air outside Jenkins and Associates was heavy with rain. the kind that drummed softly against the office windows, steady and slow, like a heartbeat reminding everyone in that room that something final was about to happen. Inside, the conference room was lined with polished oak and the faint smell of old paper. The lawyer, Mr. Jenkins, sat at the head of the table, his silver hair neatly combed, his eyes distant but kind. On the table before him lay a thick brown envelope, sealed, stamped, and waiting. Emily sat directly across from him, dressed in black. Her eyes were red from crying, though whether from grief, confusion, or guilt, even she didn't seem to know. She hadn't said much since she'd arrived. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Next to her sat Tyler, her fiancé, soon-to-be husband. He looked uneasy, glancing between Emily and the lawyer as though he didn't want to be there at all. And beside him, leaning back with that same arrogant smirk he'd worn all his life, sat Mark Delaney. He looked older now, a little grayer, a little slower, but his smile hadn't changed. It was still the same snake's grin, confident, charming, empty. When the clock struck 10, Jenkins cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said softly. "I know this is a difficult time. Mr. Reed left very specific instructions about how today should go. He requested that before we discuss any legal or financial matters, I read a personal letter addressed to his daughter." He looked directly at Emily. "To you?" Emily nodded faintly, saying nothing. Mark gave a quiet scoff, swirling the whiskey he'd poured himself from the side cabinet. "A letter, huh? Guess he always did like his little speeches." Jenkins ignored the comment. He picked up the envelope and slid a letter from inside. Thick parchment creased at the edges, written in the uneven handwriting of a man who had lived through too much. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat once more, and began to read aloud. "To my daughter, Emily. I'm writing this knowing that by the time you hear these words, I won't be there to explain them. Maybe that's for the best. Some truths are too heavy to say face to face, but they must still be said." The room went utterly silent. Only the rain outside filled the pauses between sentences. "I know anger can make the truth look like a lie. And I know that for many years you've seen me as the villain in your story. I don't blame you for that. I blame myself for not fighting harder to set things right when I had the chance. But Emily, you deserve to know what really happened." Jenkins' voice grew lower, steadier, as he read. Emily's breathing changed, slower, deeper, her eyes locked on the letter as if she could see her father sitting across the table again. 15 years ago, your mother and I lost everything. Not because I was careless, not because I stole, but because of the man sitting beside you right now. His name was once my friend, my brother in business. But when things went bad, he didn't help me, he destroyed me. He forged my signature, transferred the company in his name, and made it look like I was the one who walked away. Mark shifted in his seat, his smirk flickering just slightly. Jenkins continued reading, ignoring him completely. "When your mother asked if I'd taken the money, I said no, because I hadn't. But by then, the lie had already spread. People believed him. Even your mother did. And I can't blame her. He was smart, and I was too proud to prove him wrong. I lost everything, and my company, my reputation, and eventually, both of you." Emily's lip trembled, but she didn't look up. She stared at her hands, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. "I rebuilt what I could, slowly, quietly, with no one to lean on. And though the world forgot who I was, I never forgot who you were, Emily. You were my little girl with the scraped knees and bright eyes who once told me she had my heart. And you still do. Even when you said you hated me." Her hand went to her mouth then, trembling, as the lawyer read those last words. "I don't want your forgiveness, sweetheart. I don't expect it. I just wanted you to know the truth before I go. The truth your mother never got the chance to hear. The truth I was too late to tell." Mark leaned forward then, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, come on, Jenkins. You're really going to let this turn into a pity letter? The man lied his whole life. You know that, right?" The lawyer didn't even glance at him. His eyes stayed on the page. "Emily, everything you've known, the comfort, the stability, the life you've built, it all stands on the ashes of what he stole from me. I don't say that to hurt you, but to free you. You deserve to live without the shadow of his lies hanging over your head." Mark's jaw tightened. The smirk vanished. He leaned back, crossing his arms, but his eyes darted toward the letter like he wanted to snatch it away. "I've left everything I've rebuilt. My company, my savings, my home. Not to be divided, not to be fought over, but placed entirely in your name, because even after everything I still believe in you. Along with this letter, you'll find proof of everything I've said. The forged documents, the false transfers, the bank statements, and the affidavit from one of his former employees who finally found the courage to tell the truth. At that, Jenkins reached for another folder on the table, a thick one bound tightly, labeled Evidence Confidential. He placed it before Emily. The sound of it hitting the table echoed like thunder. If you choose to see the truth, it's all there. But if you'd rather not, I'll understand. Just know that your father loved you, even when the world turned you against him. And then Jenkins's voice cracked slightly, the first emotion he'd shown all morning, as he read the final line. Goodbye, Emily. Love always, Dad. Silence. The kind of silence that presses down on every chest in the room until it feels like you can't breathe. Emily's eyes filled completely now. Her hand shook as she reached for the folder. Her fingers hesitated on the edge for a moment before she slowly flipped it open. Inside were stacks of documents, yellowed papers, printed emails, photocopies of contracts from Reed and Delaney Construction, all dated 15 years earlier. The first few pages were business records, technical, cold. But then came the confession, a typed statement signed and notarized from one of Mark's former office managers. Mr. Delaney instructed me to forge Mr. Reed's signature on transfer forms. He said Reed would be too proud to contest it once it was done. I regret my part in it. Emily's breath hitched. Her hand went to her chest as she flipped through more. Bank statements showing Mark's account swelling in the weeks after Tom's business collapse, and letters from clients verifying payments that never reached Tom's hands. It was undeniable. She looked up slowly, not at the lawyer, not at the paper, but at Mark. Her voice came out small but sharp as glass. Is this true? Mark laughed, forced, too quick. Sweetheart, come on. You can't seriously believe a dead man's last word over. Answer the question, she interrupted, louder this time. Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside her. Dad, he whispered. But Mark ignored him, trying to wave it all off. Emily, he was bitter. He hated that I succeeded where he failed. That's all this is, one final stab from a jealous old man. But his voice was cracking now and sweat had started to beat along his temple. The lawyer closed the folder gently. Mr. Delaney, he said, calm but firm, you might want to refrain from speaking further. Everything in this file is legally verified. Mr. Reed spent years collecting this evidence before he passed. Mark's face drained of color. Emily looked at the lawyer again, her voice barely a whisper. He knew all this time? Jenkins nodded. Yes. He wanted you to find out this way, calmly, truthfully, without hate. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace. Emily pressed her hands to her face, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. Tyler reached out to comfort her, but she pulled away. When she finally looked up again, her eyes were wet but steady. He's gone, isn't he? The lawyer nodded slowly. He passed 2 nights ago. Peacefully in his sleep. The letter was the last thing he wrote. She sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, her tears tracing quiet lines down her cheeks. Outside, the rain stopped. Inside, truth, long buried under lies, finally found its way to the light. And for the first time in years, the name Thomas Reed carried not shame, but honor. The moment the last word of my letter was read, the air in that office changed. You could feel it, heavy, electric, like the seconds before a storm breaks. For 15 years, Mark Delaney had walked around untouchable. His charm, his lies, his easy smile, they'd been his armor. But now, with every word of truth laid bare, that armor started to crack. He sat there, gripping the arms of his chair, his jaw twitching. The color had drained from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. His confident smirk was gone. He looked smaller somehow, like a man finally realizing his kingdom had been built on sand. Then he stood, sudden, loud, trying to reclaim the room the way bullies always do when they're cornered. This is ridiculous, he barked, his voice trembling under the weight of panic. You're all letting a dead man slander me. Those papers, they're fake, forged. He's framing me from beyond the grave. The lawyer didn't even flinch. He just looked up from his notes with the calm patience of someone who's dealt with desperate men before. Mr. Delaney, he said evenly. The evidence your former employee provided was verified under oath before Mr. Reed's passing. There are bank records, time-stamped transfers, and notarized statements corroborating everything. Mark froze for half a second, long enough for everyone to see the truth in his silence. Then he tried to laugh it off, running a shaking hand through his hair. You think this means anything? You think people will believe this garbage? He was bitter, obsessed. You all know what he was like. But his voice was cracking now, the confidence gone. His words tumbled over themselves like a man trying to build a wall out of wet sand. Emily stood slowly. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide, red-rimmed from tears that hadn't yet fallen. For a moment she didn't speak. She just stared at him, the man she'd trusted her entire life. How could you? She finally whispered. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room sharper than any shout. Mark turned to her quickly, desperation creeping into his tone. Sweetheart, listen, this is all a misunderstanding. I was protecting you. Your father, he wasn't well. He couldn't handle the business. She took a step back. Stop, her voice broke on that single word. Stop lying, please. He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away as if his touch burned her. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. I trusted you, she said. After Mom died, you were the only one I had. You made me believe he was the bad guy. You made me hate my own father. Mark's lips trembled. For once he had no script, no clever answer, no way to twist the truth. The silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. Then the lawyer spoke again, calmly but firmly. Mr. Delaney, I'd advise you to leave now. This meeting is concluded. All necessary documents will be processed through the court. Mark's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked around, first at the lawyer, then at Tyler, his son, who sat frozen in disbelief. Tyler, he started, his voice shaking. You don't believe this, do you? But Tyler wouldn't meet his eyes. He just stared at the papers spread across the table, at the numbers, the statements, the signatures. The truth was staring him in the face. When no one answered, Mark muttered something under his breath. Something about ungrateful people and lies. And then he stormed out of the room. The sound of the door slamming echoed down the hall like a final act closing. For a long time, no one spoke. Emily just stood there, motionless. Tears sliding down her cheeks as she stared at the door her stepfather had just walked through. The lawyer quietly began gathering the documents, his movements slow, respectful, like a man leaving a graveside. When Emily finally looked up, her expression had changed. There was grief there, yes, but something else too, realization. A quiet understanding that the story she'd believed her whole life had been a lie. She turned toward the lawyer, her voice small. Where is he, my father? Where is he buried? The lawyer paused. At Willow Creek Cemetery, he said softly. Next to your mother. That was his last request. Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears weren't just from pain. They were from something deeper, the weight of truth, the ache of too many lost years. She nodded faintly, whispered a small, thank you, and walked out. Tyler followed her out the door, his hand hovering near hers but never touching. He didn't know what to say. There were no words big enough to fill what had just broken open. That evening, the sun began to set over the quiet town. The sky turned gold, then deep orange. The kind of sunset that makes everything look softer, like even the light itself is trying to apologize for what the world has done. I wasn't there to see it, but I imagine her car pulling into my old driveway, the one I'd paved myself years ago with calloused hands and stubborn hope. The same driveway that had stayed empty for over a decade. She sat in the car for a while, hands gripping the steering wheel, tears running freely now. All those years of anger, of believing the worst, all built on the lies of a man who'd called himself a friend. Finally, she got out. Walked up to the front door, knocked. When I opened it, she didn't say a word, she just stood there in the strong, confident woman she'd become. But her face was crumbling, breaking into pieces I remembered from when she was little. Her eyes were her mother's, soft and hurting. Dad, she whispered, her voice shaking. I'm sorry. For a second I couldn't move. My throat closed up, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. All those years of distance, of silence, of being a ghost in her life. And now she was standing there, trembling, asking for forgiveness I didn't even need to hear. I didn't say a word. Words felt useless in that moment. I just opened my arms. She stepped forward and I held her, held her the way I hadn't since she was a child, the way I thought I never would again. And she cried. Not the soft kind of crying, but the kind that comes from deep inside where years of guilt and grief finally break loose. She sobbed against my chest, her tears soaking into my shirt, and all I could do was hold her tighter, one hand on her back, whispering, "It's okay. It's okay now." There was no speech, no grand moment of revelation. Just a father and daughter, broken but finally whole again. We stood there for a long time, the house quiet except for her sobs and the faint ticking of the old clock in the hall. That clock had ticked through every lonely year, every missed birthday. Every night I sat wondering if she'd ever come back. Now it ticked softly in rhythm with her breathing. That night, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had fallen apart years ago. The same table where Laura once laughed, where bills once piled up, where I once slammed my fist in anger. But now it felt different. The ghosts had quieted. Emily told me everything. How Mark had filled her head with lies, how he'd told her I'd abandoned them, how he made himself the hero of a story I never got to defend myself in. And I listened, not angry, not bitter, just sad for all the years we'd lost to a lie. When she finished, she looked down, her voice trembling. "I can't believe I didn't see it, Dad. I can't believe I let him turn me against you." I reached across the table, placed my hand over hers, and said quietly, "You were a kid. Emily, you trusted the wrong man, but you're here now. That's what matters." She smiled through her tears, and that same little crooked smile she had when she was 10. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were family again. We talked until the candles burned low. She laughed at old stories, asked about things she'd forgotten. The fishing trips, the summer storms, the nights we stayed up watching lightning bugs through her window. And though the years couldn't be undone, that night began to stitch something back together. Not perfectly. Scars never fade completely, but strong enough to hold. When she finally left, she hugged me again at the door, longer this time. "I'll come by tomorrow," she said softly. "There's a lot I want to fix." And I just nodded, smiling through tears I didn't bother to hide. Because after 15 years of silence, my daughter finally called me Dad again. And for me, that was enough. Time has a strange way of healing. Not with loud gestures or sudden forgiveness, but with quiet days that turn into weeks, and weeks that turn into months. A few months after the will reading, the world around Emily, and even mine, began to settle again. The storm had passed, but it left behind a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, aching kind that used to hang over every dinner table, every unanswered call, every memory of what we'd lost, but a softer silence. The kind that feels like peace. Emily started visiting often. At first, she came just to help sort through paperwork. Company documents, old records, the kind of things I hadn't touched in years. But soon it became more than that. She wanted to learn. She wanted to understand everything. The business, the choices I made, the mistakes I owned. She asked questions not like a child needing answers, but like a woman ready to rebuild what had once been destroyed. One morning, she came into my office. My old office, the one I'd kept simple all my life, a single desk, a photo of her and her mother, and the faded blueprint of the very first house Reed and Delaney Construction ever built. She stood there quietly for a while, looking at that blueprint, then turned to me with a soft determination in her eyes. "Dad," she said, "I want to take over the company." For a second, I just stared at her, unsure if I'd heard right. She must have seen the hesitation in my face because she added quickly, "Not for the money, not to prove anything. I just want to make things right again. I want to rebuild what you started, our name, our truth." Her words hit deeper than she probably realized. I'd built that company from the ground up with my bare hands, back when I was young, strong, and foolish enough to think loyalty meant something to everyone. And though Mark had taken it away piece by piece, brick by brick, hearing her say our name made something inside me finally feel whole again. So I nodded. "It's yours," I said quietly, "but build it your way, not mine." And she did. In the months that followed, Emily transformed Reed Construction. The Delaney name was the first thing she removed from the signage. She said it didn't belong there anymore, and she was right. She brought in new people, honest ones. She took on projects that mattered, Not the flashy ones meant to impress investors, but the kind that actually helped families, affordable housing, schools, places where memories could grow. Every time I watched her work, I saw a reflection of the woman her mother once was, in kind, firm, and full of purpose. She didn't just rebuild a company. She rebuilt a legacy. As for Mark, his truth didn't stay hidden for long. Once the documents went public, partners started pulling out, clients withdrew, and his once spotless reputation began to crumble under the weight of his own lies. Investigations reopened old cases. Names came forward, people he'd stepped on, betrayed, stolen from. And though I never raised a hand against him, never spoke a word in court, I didn't need to. Truth had finally done what I couldn't. It had stripped him of everything he'd used to hurt others. I heard he tried to start over somewhere new, but it didn't last. The thing about men like him is they're not built for honesty. Their entire foundation depends on deceit, and once that cracks, there's nothing left to stand on. So, yes, silence did its own kind of justice. I never gloated, never celebrated his downfall. I didn't need to. Watching Emily step into her strength, watching her rise from the same ashes he tried to bury me in, that was enough. That was the quiet revenge that life delivers when you stop chasing it and start trusting that truth will do its work. You see, people often think revenge needs flames, shouting, vengeance, destruction. But the older I got, the more I realized something simple. Fire burns fast, but truth burns forever. Revenge doesn't always come with fury. Sometimes it comes with time, with patience, with a signature on a single sheet of paper that says, "This is mine again." Because true justice doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause. It just needs the right moment. The moment when those who doubted you finally see who you really were all along. And that's what Emily did for me. She showed the world the truth. Not through revenge, not through shouting, but through quiet strength. She carried the same last name they once mocked, the same legacy they thought was ruined, and she made it mean something again. Every time I visited the new office, I'd see the company logo on the glass door. Reed Builders, founded on integrity. Rebuilt by truth. She came up with that line herself. I remember standing there the first time I saw it, running my hand over the letters, my eyes welling up with a pride I hadn't felt in years. Sometimes, I still think about how differently things could have gone. If I'd fought back with anger, if I'd wasted my years chasing revenge instead of rebuilding quietly. Maybe I would have gotten some satisfaction in the short run. Maybe I would have felt strong, but that kind of strength fades. What lasts is peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you didn't have to destroy someone else to stand tall again. In the end, life has a way of writing its own justice. It doesn't always happen when you want it to or how you imagine it will, but it comes, quietly, patiently. The truth doesn't rush. It waits, it watches. And when it finally steps into the light, it doesn't shout, it simply stands there undeniable. So if you ask me now, was it worth it? The years of silence, the long road back, the pain of watching everything fall apart. Yes, every second, because revenge that burns bright fades fast. But truth, my truth stays. And in the end, the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's letting them live long enough to see that you were right, all along.